Hello everyone, and welcome to A Teacher Explains.
Think about the last time you finished a series and immediately jumped online to read what everyone else was saying about it. Or maybe you found yourself watching a show just to make fun of it with your friends. Well, if you've done any of that, you're not just some passive couch potato. You are an active, engaged participant in the media you consume. And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. This really fascinating journey in media theory, from seeing audiences as passive to understanding them as active.
I'm a teacher, and in this explainer, I'm going to break down the massive shift in how we understand media audiences.
For the longest time, researchers were pretty much obsessed with one thing: the power of the media. But then a really important shift happened. The spotlight moved away from what the media was doing and turned right onto the audience itself. So let's go back to the early days of mass media. Radio, the first TVs. The prevailing theory back then was that media acted like a magic bullet or a hypodermic needle. The idea was that messages were just injected directly into the minds of the public, and people were seen as this uniform, helpless mass, just soaking it all up. It was a completely one-way street. All the power was with the media, and the audience, well, they were just along for the ride. But, of course, there was a huge problem with that whole magic bullet idea. It just didn't hold up in the real world. People aren't robots, right? We all have our own thoughts, our own backgrounds, our own feelings, and all of that shapes how we react to what we see and hear. And once researchers started to realize this, it triggered a complete paradigm shift. They knew they needed a better model for understanding this really complex stance between media and its audience. So that old way of thinking, it was all driven by this one central question: what do media do to people? And if you think about it, that question itself positions the audience as a passive target, just the recipient of whatever the media throws at them. And then someone flipped the script. They posed a new question that completely changed the game. What do people do with media? It might seem like a small change, but that shift in phrasing represents a massive leap in thinking. All of a sudden, the focus was on the audience, on their agency, their choices, and what motivates them. And out of this new perspective came one of the most important audience-focused theories we have: uses and gratifications. This framework doesn't see people as passive sponges. Instead, it sees us as active, goal-oriented consumers who are using media for our own purposes. Now, what's really interesting is this idea of an active audience didn't just appear out of thin air. There were hints of it much earlier. Way back in the 1940s, studies on radio listeners started to show that media fulfilled certain needs. A researcher named Herta Herzog did some groundbreaking work identifying why people listen to radio soap operas, finding motivations like emotional release or getting advice. And later, Wilbur Schramm came up with his fraction of selection idea, which basically says we choose our media by subconsciously weighing the reward we expect to get against how much effort it's going to take. Okay, so the uses and gratifications theory really boils down to 5 core assumptions. First, the audience is active and its media use is goal-oriented. We're using it for a reason. Second, we are the ones who link our needs to our specific media choices. We're in the driver's seat. Third, media is just one of many options out there to satisfy our needs. It competes with talking to friends, going for a walk, you name it. Fourth, we're generally self-aware enough to be able to explain why we use the media we do. And fifth, and this is a big one, value judgments about the cultural significance of media should be suspended. Basically, who's to say what's a good or bad use of media? Your reasons are your reasons. So, it's really important to draw a line between media functions and media uses. A news organization, for example, might serve the societal function of surveillance, keeping us all informed. But your individual use of the news could be totally different. Maybe you watch it to feel like a responsible citizen, or maybe just have something to chat about at work, or maybe it's just background noise while you're making dinner. The function is broad, but the use is personal. And here's another great distinction: the difference between audience activity and audience activeness. They sound similar, but they're not the same. Activity is what you do, like choosing to watch a show. Activeness is how engaged your brain is. So just mindlessly scrolling through a feed is activity, but getting completely lost in a film, thinking about the plot, feeling what the characters feel, that's activeness. It's a much deeper level of psychological engagement. Now, the early versions of this theory got some pushback. Critics said, okay, this is great for understanding why people use media, but what about the effects? And that's a fair point. So more modern research has worked to connect the two. And what it shows is that our motivations for using media, our uses, actually have a direct impact on the kinds of effects that media will have on us, whether that's changing our attitudes or what we learn.
And that leads us perfectly into our next big idea. We've talked about what people do with media, but now let's talk about how they interpret it. This is where reception studies come into the picture. The focus here shifts from use to the actual process of making meaning. It's all about how we, the audience, actively build an understanding of what we're watching. One of the absolute cornerstone ideas here is Stuart Hull's encoding/decoding model. Think of it like this. A TV producer encodes a show with their intended meaning, but we, the audience, decode that message based on our own unique backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences. So a film that was intended to be a patriotic story might be seen by someone else as propaganda. The meaning isn't fixed in the text. It's created in that moment of interaction between the text and the viewer. And Hall actually said there are 3 basic ways we can decode a message. First is the dominant reading, where you pretty much accept the intended meaning wholesale. Second is the negotiated reading, where you accept the big picture, but you tweak some of the ideas to fit your own life. And third is the oppositional reading, where you see the dominant meaning, but you completely reject it. We really have to talk about the huge contributions from feminist scholars here. They brought a critical lens to reception studies by focusing on how things like gender and power shape our interpretations. They were instrumental in highlighting women not just as viewers, but as active makers of meaning, which really challenged that old idea that audiences were just ideologically controlled.
A perfect example of this is Janice Radway's famous study of women who read romance novels. Now, on the surface, those books often reinforce very traditional, patriarchal ideas. But Radway found that the women reading them were doing something much more complex. They were actively reinterpreting the stories, using the very act of reading as a form of personal escape and a quiet resistance to the demands of their daily lives.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. We've moved from this old, simplistic idea of a passive audience being spoon-fed messages to a much more sophisticated, empowering view. We now understand that the person on the other side of the screen is an active, thinking participant in the whole process. So if you're going to take anything away from this, let it be these key points. First, audiences aren't passive, they're active and interpretive. Second, how we use media is a complex mix of our own motivations and our social context. And finally, the most important change in the entire field has been this pivot away from media power and toward recognizing audience agency.
And this really brings it all back to you, doesn't it? These aren't just abstract theories. They're frameworks for understanding our own media habits. So I'll leave you with this question to think about. In your own daily life, how are you actively using and interpreting the media you consume?
Thank you for joining me for this explainer. The primary sources used are on the screen now. I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel.